and all. Thanks for joining us with my talk about creating reusable Puppet profiles. Let me first start introducing myself. Who am I? I used to go to university to become a molecular biologist, and I slowly descended into the dark side, as my former colleagues used to say. In my days, we used to gain a lot of data. That was the original age of big data, when big data was stuff that no longer fitted into an Excel sheet. That's how I became an bioinformatician. That meant no longer creating my own data, then just manipulating it with code, doing statistics and stuff. And as some of you perhaps know, in a academic environment, the software developer is always also most of the time the server guy. So I became knowledgeable about all things operations, and according to my colleagues, I descended into the dark side again by mostly doing ops. And that's how I now, in the last 15 years, how I've developed, and I'm now a cloud engineer at a Dutch consultancy company called The Factory, where I just started on the 1st of September. And today we'll be discussing how Puppet code developed through the ages. I started Puppet around 0.24, and how we used to write code was a little bit like this. It was quite procedural, where we basically started off with, I need an Apache web server, it needs some form of runtime, so let's install PHP. Oh yes, it's a WordPress, so we'll dump in MySQL as well. It will probably need some accounting. I'll need a database. Oh wait, it's exposed to the internet, so we'll stick in the firewall as well, and then we'll open up some ports. And that's how Puppet code used to develop quite organically, but it didn't help us understand it. It didn't help us grow the code, didn't make us love it. And in those days, what we used to do, if we had one or two of similar things, we used to use Puppet inheritance, where we would have the big ball of mass class, and then we would inherit, and then we would layer on a little bit of customer code or project code or whatever you were doing at the time, and it made sense to you to extend it, the big blob we already had. But that actually made things worse. Became even more unreadable, became even less extendable, became even less readable, understandable of what was going on at any given time. You would basically have to review the entire catalog to make sure what bits were applied, what bits weren't applied. That actually made life a bit worse. And then in around 2012, so that's nearly a decade ago, a person called Craig Dunn came up with a design pattern that's, well, to me, sounded a lot like the model view controller that proper air quotes programming language had developed, and that splits our code into manageable chunks. So at first, we should actually take a step back. Everybody that's any practitioner using Puppet now knows modules, but that actually was a thing that came about around the same time. And then Craig said, no, we're not just going to use modules, we're going to functionally separate the code into layers, basically similar to what we are used to with High-Run now, but also we'll split out the code in layers by functionality. Because at the end of the day, any module, even roles or profiles, they're modules, but they mean something different being used in the system. So first of all, as we sort of alluded to already, we have component modules that are manage one particular technology, say Apache, Nginx, MySQL, and they just do that, but they do it very well. And that's the stuff that we can see on Forge, on the Puppet Forge, where we can download our modules, where we can review the code. And then we have profiles. Profiles are actually magic sauce to say of how at an individual company or project we combine stuff together, often called wrapper classes that make sure that the various components are linked together, work well, hopefully. And then the top layer are called roles, and roles are the best way to describe them is a module that declares what a system is going to be like. So the best practice is to have one role assigned to a node, and then a role has multiple profiles, and a profile might manipulate several component modules. Then the roles should have a name that even, for instance, the business people or the developers understand what's going to be applied. So let's say database, a web server. So if we deep dive a bit further into this, we were getting the hang of these things. So what we used to see was we have a role of a web server, we have a role web database, and then we would have the all-in-one dev station, which actually modeled our comprehension of what's going on in our platforms again a little bit. The other option people found was that they basically started programming in YAML way before it became popular in the Kubernetes age, where we especially define types. So I need a certain amount of vhosts on the system installed. Instead of describing it into Puppet code directly, we would stick it in Hiera or in an ENC like Puppet Enterprise or the Foreman. And that actually made life also a little bit difficult. One is, to me, YAML is, although it's supposed to be human readable, it's actually not that easy to read for me. It also separates a lot of the code and what's considered configuration from each other, which also makes reviewing the current state of a platform harder as well, because now you not only need to look at the code, but you need to look at your YAML. If it's YAML, it's sort of relatively okay, because we can still use standard code, best practices for coding standards and the like on there. So we can still do a git diff on them, but that becomes harder when we start storing stuff in Puppet Enterprise, because then we need to do queries across multiple instances. So that was a next layer of problems. So we starting to use roles. Code becomes more clear, but we're still not finding an ideal place to model our platforms. So even the lovely people at Puppet have described several ways of how we could set up roles and profiles. More specifically, how we could deal with complexity. Say, for instance, that all-in-one role we've seen before, how we could go about setting those up. We could either make granular roles where we say we'll have this web server and we'll have the all-in-one, or we'll do conditional logic based on facts. Say we'll have a fact called production, and we have a fact saying it's a web server. Then in Hiera we can layer our config together in such a way that it actually becomes a distinct node. We can nest roles, which is, to me, terrible. Basically, the next three are sort of an iteration on the same idea. We'll have a nested role. We'll have multiple roles, which is a deviation from the best practice we've just discussed. And nested roles and super profile are sort of the same thing. Nested roles basically means we'll use inheritance. So the all-in-one will inherit from the web server, and then we'll stick in the database role somewhere, or we'll call them profiles, but they're actually super profiles. So they manipulate actually more things than we need them to do. Let's say we'll have a super profile called web server, where we actually not only manipulate the web server, but we'll make sure there's a database available for us. We'll make sure that the PHP is installed. And then we'll start. The other one is actually what we described before, is basically programming in YAML or in the external node classifier. Maybe it's not YAML, but and that actually makes life, as I said, hard if you want to review what is going on. So let's start. Let's stop complaining and start building up what I think should be a reusable profile. So not that, well, actually quite a while ago already, Puppet, the guys at Puppet came out with a tool called PDK, which is the Puppet development kit, and that sort of streamlined way modules get set up. And why is this important? Similar to when you write code in any other language, say Ruby, say Golang, it's important that when a new developer or you 6 months from now open up an old project and sort of recognize what is going on just by looking at the code. Familiar stuff is in places it should be. Since Puppet is a language that expects stuff in certain places, most of the time your module structure will actually be the way it should be, but tools might be missing, like your unit testing, like your linting, like your document styles. So when I suggest one and all starts using PDK, where we can create a new module that will always look the same, it's basically by using PDK new module, or if you have an existing module, we'll use PDK convert to turn them into something PDK. And then it will have a certain layout, it will have all the tools we need, it will have all the rake tasks we need to use the tools. You either use the upstream template, very good template that Puppet brings out, or you use your own template. And then you can tweak the settings you want. Puppet also keeps bringing out iterations of this module, so we can use a Puppet update to apply this new version that we'll have the new version of all the tool sets. And this becomes cumbersome if you have multiple modules. So they also brought out a tool called PDK sync, which for some of you might still know the module sync, which was the original way of manipulating multiple modules at the same time. So now they have a version of PDK sync that does the same thing. And at the same time, not only can we create a new module in a standardized way, PDK now also allows you to create new classes, new defined types, new functions in a standardized way. So it will always show up at the same place. If you have a new class or defined type, it will also create the unit test automatically, so you don't forget. So it helps you on the way to standardizing your layout and making it understandable for new people or old people reviewing. At the same time, please also document your code. It's been made very easy to generate documentation from Puppet modules. Just use the correct tags in your headers, and then it will automatically be generated you can turn it automatically into a nice text file which you can scrape and put together, so people can actually understand what's going on and not just need to read your code. They can also read why a variable is there, what it does, have a nice little example, as I said up here, where we build out a single Nomad node, and by using a simple rake task, we can turn that into a text file. And since it has a companion rake task, we can basically turn this into something we can automate in our release schedule. So when we tag something, we'll need to make sure that we've bumped the version module, but we also need to make sure that we've regenerated the documentation. And at the same time, not only write your documentation, validate your code. So it's something which PDK also has built in. We can validate our code. And that basically is it valid Puppet? Are your functions valid Ruby? Does it apply the correct style we hope to see. For that, there's PDK has built-in Puppet lint support, and Puppet lint has the ability to have several modules, say that. Well, modules here is a bit of an overloaded term, but basically it's a plugin that we can add to your Puppet lint, and then that you write in Ruby, and then you can make up your own style guides. So do we have functions where, say, we'll have a Boolean feature flag, basically saying are your metrics collections turned on? And we could, for instance, write a plugin that checks if any and all profiles will have at least a feature flag that says collect metrics. Is it there? Is it not there? But most of the time, it's used for literally checking if your style guide's been followed. But you could also add plugins that check for more functional ideas or agreements we've made to use code in a certain way. Then, of course, we can also run our unit tests or even our acceptance tests using Beaker. And then roles become a lot more easy to follow. For instance, my web server now no longer uses inheritance, but basically uses a basic class called Bootstrap, where we do stuff like my user accounting, my SSH setup, and then we layer on top the databases and the web servers. And the rest of it actually comes from Hira. To make your code even more clear to use, or easier to use, we can now start, since Puppet 5, I believe, we can actually use sort of strong typing on variables. Before, we used to have basically anything pretty much was a string or a Boolean, and the rest we would have to validate in code. And now we can actually start making it fairly well understood just by looking at the type declarations. So in this case, my temp path is an absolute path. So that's something that's not used current directly. Now it needs to be an absolute path to somewhere. And there's no default. So my default is, well, actually, I don't know. So if someone wants to use this profile, that's something that they need to set for sure. And then all the other flags are, in my case, a Boolean. So make sure that everything turns up in a certain conft directory, and everything else can be ignored. And then there's ways around an enum. So basically, there's a list of things that the answer could be, and we'll make it optional. So if it's not set, then my code will deal with it somehow. And then the last one is actually interesting, where we come up with our own defined type. So if the list of enums becomes very long, we actually can build a type that says there's a list of things, it can only be the following things. And then, as you see, the last line actually said a message for a Puppet lint to ignore why there is no trailing comma, which is one of the style things we will always want to do in Puppet. But if you add here the trailing comma, then somewhere in the inner workings of Puppet, the thing goes wrong. So we'll just exclude it from our linting, but it's something we do consciously. Then the next thing is start looking at defined types. Most modules, or some modules, will provide one. Say here, the Apache vhost. In my case, in this particular Puppet tree, we'll end up with 75 instances of an Apache vhost, which seems okay. But then let's think, I want to turn off the TLS 1.2 or 1.0 and switch it on to 1.3, which means my entire code base needs to be changed in 75 places, which is you're bound to forget one, or you'll end up in a race condition that doesn't actually work for you. So what I suggest is wrapping defined types that you use a lot into your own defined types, where you set more same values for your own environment. So in this case, I've wrapped not only wrapped the the Apache vhost define type, but I've wrapped that into another define type where I say all my static web apps, so my Yugo documentation websites, they all will have a certain form that needs to be applied. We'll have an Apache vhost, and we'll have an instance of my application, which basically in my case means an RPM is installed somewhere on the system, which is always in the same place. And we'll need to make sure it's installed before my vhost gets there. And my vhost will always have the certain amount of flags set up, where I choose what the name is, what the how I'm going to proxy it, whether or not I'm going to do it, whether or not my SSL is turned on, and whether or not I'm going to use Let's Encrypt for it. And then basically the list of questions you need to ask users of your profile are going to be a lot less, because there's a lot less options, and B, there's going to be defaults for most of them. And basically in this case, I've reduced most of the questions, but actually any user that wants to create a new static app vhost somewhere only needs to answer 3 questions. What's this public URL? What's the how we're going to reference it internally? And what is the package name, which we're going to put in our internal repository anyway. And then if you have a zoom in a bit more on the app instance, this is a version or a subsection of my PHP application define type, and there I say my applications will always need a PHP pool. They need to have some caching set up. I need to make sure that my logs can be shipped. I need to make sure that my metrics are shipped. And if you remember back to slide 1 or so, say most of that stuff was in there, but it wasn't feature flagged. So when we it was whether either it was all there or it wasn't there, or if you applied it to a new server and certain directories weren't there or certain permissions were there, all this was pear-shaped. So I stuck them behind the feature flag, even though the feature flag might always be on, or by default on. I can turn them off later on if for some reason or not, valid or not, I want to turn it off. So now instead of creating your resources as the upstream defined type, now we will just use the local, more fine-grained local defined type. So in my case, my Profile Symphony in PHP framework exposes its own vhost defined type, and same for Drupal or my WordPress or my Yugo. Yes, as I said, feature flag it all, even though things might always be turned on. So in this case, here I say everything's false, but in my higher profiles, I always make sure that Nginx is my preferred website platform. And teams that don't want to use Nginx, or for some reason can't use Nginx, in their layer in Hira, they're allowed to just override it. And then in Hira, we can now actually query what teams, what platforms are deviating from the standard, which is easy to set up and is most of the time very useful for some form of auditing, either internal or external, saying, yes, everybody's on Nginx except for the following teams for which we have an agreement or a written permission that we can deviate. And then basically in Hira turns into this. On my platform, I have an alert manager turned on. I have KeepAliveD turned on. So it's going to be some form of metric system that does alerting, but it's also HA because of the KeepAliveD. In this way, I can very easily grab through my Hira to work out what teams have turned on. For if you don't like Hira, there's a system called Hierarchia, which unfortunately for the last couple of years the development has stopped, but that allows you to expose your Hira structure as an API. And then we can even allow people within that API to use feature flags. There's basically an airbag on top of Hira, so we can allow them to set that feature flag on what kind of web server are allowed to use. So that's the end of my presentation. Thanks for listening. If you want to contact me, I'm available accessible on my email address. I'm also on Twitter, so when you yell at me for ruining your Puppet code, please do it there. This presentation, by the time this recording goes out, will be available on my SlideShare. And if you want to dig a bit deeper into what I've been describing so far in this presentation, you can go into my my profiles module, which I freely and openly distribute on GitHub. Thank you. So I think we'll have a bit of time for Q&A. So please ask your questions to the moderator.